Okay, today we're in Sadi Beis Ches, where the Ramati N brings up a certain din. We're actually going to start not from the Sadi Beis side of it, from Kafei, and we're going to talk about this rule, this principle called Ein Habluah Yotzeh Mikli B'lo Rotev. So just for starters, what that means is a balua means something that's not an inherent tam. Doesn't a piece of meat has its own tam to it, but this is not the piece of meat. It absorbed tam from something else. It's a balua. So then tam from a balua can't transfer from one thing to another. We'll see oichel and kli to kli. It can't transfer from one thing to another unless there's routev. Okay, routev means some kind of significant amount of sauce or liquid there to help the transfer happen. Okay, so it doesn't happen. The things that are balua won't transfer by themselves. Things that are not balua will transfer, but things that are balua won't transfer unless there is right. Okay, and one of the main rayas to that din comes with the din of tipas chalav, where the Gemara talks about that a drop of milk fell onto a piece of meat, and how much of the meat in the pot becomes treif, or when does the milk become butter? All kinds of parts, the details to that din. But the things like this. Who cares that the milk only fell on one piece, but all the pieces are touching each other? So why doesn't the time keep on going from there on and on and on and on? So you see from there that since the milk is only balua, it's only absorbed into the meat. It's not inherently part of it. It's not the inherent taste of the meat. It's only balua. So since it's only balua, so the Blios doesn't transfer to the next thing unless it's routev. Now, the Gemara never says the rule, makes a rule called Ein Habluah Yotzeh. The Gemara never says such a rule like that. It's our understanding of that. Then it talks about routev. That Gemara talks about routev, needing routev for things to happen, but it never says there's such a rule that says, oh, because it's balua, Ein Habluah Yotzeh. Those words are from Rishonim. They make up this rule called Ein Habluah Yotzeh, but it comes from this Gemara Tipas Chalav. To the point that Sefer Truma, who's one of the earliest Rishonim that I know of, who talks about this, says that if you work out the cheshbonos, if you don't hold the chanam b'shar yisurim, then it means if you're makel about chanam b'shar yisurim, then you have no right to this din in Habluah Yotzeh, because the reason why the time is not transferring is not because of Habluah Yotzeh. The reason why the Gemara's case the time doesn't transfer is because of the no chanam b'shar yisurim. So what does that mean? So we the Mechaber holds the Mechaber. Hold on 1 second. The Mechaber. Give me 1 second. Okay, thank you. The Mechaber doesn't hold the Mechaber holds it's not machmer for chanam b'shar yisurim. Even Ramad Mikra didn't hold that there's no chanam b'shar yisurim. So really, the Sefer Truma says, "Imken, you should have no right to this din of Ein Habluah Yotzeh." Now there are other rayas to the din, not such as strong rayas, but others don't bring this. They don't mention this thing. Which I'm saying in Cheshbon it works out that we should say if you make about chanam b'shar yisurim, which Mikra din we are, then you shouldn't be machmir of Ein Habluah Yotzeh. But somehow that never made it past the Sefer Truma. Hagam that he's one of the ikar sources for this din. Okay. Now, so we have this thing, Ein Habluah Yotzeh Mikli Kli. I'm sorry. So now the case in the Gemara is time going from an oichel to an oichel. And I told you that the milk fell into the pot, and it doesn't transfer from that piece to other pieces there. So it doesn't go from an oichel to an oichel. It does not transfer. Okay, that's the Gemara. There are other rayas, but that's the raya we're going to focus on. It's the main raya. Doesn't go from there. So the Rashba says, okay, that's fine. He says, so tell me, if Blios don't transfer from one thing to another without routev, he says, so now we have another Gemara. We have the Gemara of not barnat. Okay, what's the Gemara of not barnat says is that if you have a piece of fish and you put it onto a fleshik plate, so you can eat that fish with milk. Okay, you can eat it with kutaf. You can eat it with dairy foods afterwards. Why? Because it's not barnat. Tom has to go from the meat into the plate, from the plate into the fish, and so it's not barnat, and you can eat that with milk. Okay, we're not talking about not barnat today. But the Rav says, wait a second. If Blios don't transfer without routev, so then no time will transfer from the plate into the fish. So who needs it then of not barnat? Who cares whether this new thing called not barnat? We don't need not barnat. There's no time transfers because Ein Habluah Yotzeh. The plate is fleshik. There's not a piece of meat. It's fleshik. It has a Blios of fleshik in it. So it has a Blios of flesh. So Blios can't transfer without routev. So I put a piece of fish onto the plate. No time should transfer. So who needs it of not barnat? Okay, so he's asking kasha on this thing. Again, there's no Gemara that says there's a rule of ein ablu yotze. It's medayik from a Gemara.
Did you differentiate here, did I miss it at any point between
That's what we're getting to. That's what we're getting to. You see there's 4 boxes on this chart? Okay, so that's okay. So this is the Rashba's kasha. The Gemara says, the Rai comes from a Gemara about going from an oichel to an oichel. The Rash says, wait a second, but I see this din there's a din of, we need not to be naked about this, not this case. So the Rashba says that tells you that from a kli, tam does transfer. It only doesn't transfer from an oichel to an oichel, but from a kli, it will transfer, okay? So only from oichel is there such a rule of ein ablu yotze, but not from a kli. So he says, what's the difference? If Blios transfer and they transfer, what's the difference? So he says like this. He says, when you have a food, let's say you have a piece of meat, the meat has its own tam to it. So when I put in another tam into it, now it's a mixture of tam, and somehow it's harder for the mixture of tam and won't transfer without roughage. But if you have a kli, there's nothing. There's a piece of metal. So the tam that's in there is just floating by itself. It's like easy for that tam to get out, and you don't need roughage to get it out. As opposed to the oichel, you sort of have to extract the tam out of the rest of the tam. Do I know what I'm talking about? No. So he says it's from from a kli, it's just like sitting in a container. It's easy to get it out. So tam transit, a balua will transfer. But from oichel, doesn't work like that. From an oichel, it's harder to get it out, and therefore it doesn't work. Okay, so he says, "Ubema'at resicha yotzes Blios mehem." Okay, whatever, because it's loose, it's just like floating in there and works out. Okay, so these two didn't that from oichel to an oichel there's no time transfers, and from a kli there is transfer. That's in Siman Kuf Hey. Mechaber brings it in Siman Kuf Hey. I should have put on the screen. In Siman Kuf Hey halacha zayin, the Mechaber brings this in. Ein ablu yotzeh mi oichel b'lo routev. And the Ramah sticks in over there the part that says from this Rashba that from a kli will be yotzeh. Okay, and the Taz sticks in one more case. The Taz sticks in another case that it goes from an oichel to a kli. It will not transfer either. Okay, it's only the Rashba is saying to us that time transfers from a kli. It could transfer because it's sitting by itself. But if it's from an oichel, then it makes no difference. From an oichel to just like the Gemara says, from an oichel to an oichel can't transfer. So too, from an oichel to a kli can't transfer either. But below right. Again, a balua can't transfer like that without right. Okay. So now, if you look at the Rashba, I told you the Rashba says the logic of what he says is because the tam of a kli is just sitting in there and it's easy to get it out. So if you would look at that, you would say is that but it depends on where the blia is. It's in a kli. So if it's in a kli, it can get out. It shouldn't make a difference of what it's going into. Okay, it depends if it's coming from an oichel or from a kli. It shouldn't make a difference if it's going to an oichel or to a kli. It's only depending on where it comes from. The Rashba is because it's like sitting there in a container, just empty and ready to come out. So the Shah says, the problem is that the Ramah by our din said ein ablu yotzeh mi kli l'kli. Okay, the Ramah says that he says not to do it l'chatchila. We'll talk about that in a second. But the ikar din we say is believe does not go mi kli l'kli. So the Shah said, and it's not just in our case; it's in other cases, and others who say the same thing also. Our din in Tzadi Beis said, because the Ramah said, don't worry about it. Midi the have a steak there is no yiguz zu bezu the ain't oisin zu zu migia. They don't. There's no bli yotzeh mi kli l'kli, but without any routev. So he says, so what's going on over here? He says the Ramah in Kuf Hey brings the Rashba who says from a kli is different. Blue can't come out from a kli. Well, but in our din, the Ramah says that blue can't go from a kli to a kli. So what's the difference? He says like you shouldn't do it, but in Ikra din, Tom does not transfer from kli to a kli. Okay, so for that matter, why lechatchila? If Blios don't transfer, don't go me something to something. Then why, special by the case of a kli, is he saying lechatchila you shouldn't do it? Why is he more mikli kli is he machmir? But oichel doesn't say to be machmir on that. So what's going on here? What's the reason?
The Shach is talking?
No, this is now I'm just answering your question. The first part is the Shach.
Who says lechatchila you should be machmir?
The Ramah says lechatchila to be machmir. The Ramah says lechatchila to be machmir. So that's my question. Just say, well, why lechatchila are you being machmir? Okay. What's the lechatchila? But it's the Shach's question, which is if the Rashba said was that from a kli is different because it's where it comes from. What's the difference what it goes to? Okay, so So the answer is, I don't know. Oh, okay, I shouldn't say I don't know. Okay. The answer is, it's not clear. Somehow going into an oichel makes it different than going into a kli. If the shachs points it,
you could posit some kind of thing, you know. It needs the food as a connection to draw out. And so if it's coming out of a kli, it has that mind out. Oichel is schlepping it out, it'll come out.
So wait. So you could say all of that. You could say all of that if you only open the Shulchan Aruch. If you only open, and you saw if you just saw this chart, then you could say, yeah, it has to do with oichel dragging it out, all kinds of things like that. But the Rashba, the din that from a kli is different comes from a Rashba. Okay, the Rashba is then based on the din of not bernat. Okay, and the Rashba, it all has to do with what it's coming from. He doesn't say it has anything to do with what it's going to. He says because it's coming from a kli, the kli is empty, and the Blios are absorbed. They're just sitting there. It's different than an oichel.
You want to know how do we know this? That from kli to kli is different.
I think it's a different svara that oichel conforms to the kli. It's literally no barrier. It's supposed to kli. It's scientifically.
You're missing my point. I'm not saying we can't think of. I'm not saying we can't think of an answer. I'm saying is that the din that a kli is different comes from a Rashba who says the kli is different because in an oichel the food is mixed with other things.
The Gemara is a kli. That's not the context of the
No. The Rashba got from a kli to an oichel actually. So the Rashba says the reason why kli is different from kli to coming from a kli to an oichel is different from an oichel to an oichel is because in an oichel the food is mixed with other tamim, mixed with the other tam that's in the kli, the oichel, and in a kli, it's sitting empty. The kli is just, the blia is just in there. It's mixed with metal. There's nothing mixed with anything. So that has to do with where it's coming from. He didn't say anything to do with where it's going to. So I'm not saying we can't give explanations. We can make up explanations, but where do they come from? Well, why didn't say that?
Who's the person who says this chiluk between bantu, kli to oichel, kli to kli?
Doesn't the Gemara say clearly?
No, there's no, ain't no Gemara. No. So all of this is all very vague, Mr. Beginning. All this is very vague. There's no Gemara for anything. Even the whole thing that in a blue Yotzeh, not everyone agrees to it, not everyone should agree to it, because it's not a Gemara. It's a diak in a Gemara of Tipas Cholav, which not everybody agrees to that. Not everybody agrees to that. Okay, but anyhow, these are our rules. Sorry, shouldn't see that yet. Okay. So I have a potential long explanation for why the Rambam is machmir lechatchila. I'm not going to tell it to you. Okay, I'm going to spare you a long explanation for why maybe the Rambam is machmir lechatchila in one specific case. Only machmir in one case lechatchila. For now, I'm going to tell you because it's going to get to the bottom. Mikli lekli. The Rambam says lechatchila you shouldn't do it. The other case he did not say that you shouldn't do lechatchila. We'll go with a simple reason, which is going to be again in a second, which is. People says maybe the reason to be machmir lechatchila is because you have to always be worried if it's mikli lekli, maybe there'll be food inside the kli and it'll spill over, and all of a sudden they'll be right there, so you should be machmir on. Okay, let's say for that for now. Okay, so now I'm going to give you just a few details, but not negate them later on. I'm just going to mention we're talking about ein blua Yotzeh, 3 different pratim about that din. Aside from these kind of bigger problem. One is when the isser is a davar shamin, is a fatty type of a food, then it does transfer. Ein blua Yotzeh is only for so to speak regular foods. When it's a davar shamin, it does. And for this kind of a thing, usually we say we're not bekim enough to know what's a davar shamin. For this case, we do. We are.
Where does that come from?
Which one come from?
The chumrah of shamin.
See, I don't know what it says. This. The Mechaber Kufay. The Mechaber, a lot of this is in Kufay. It's in the Mechaber Kufay. Okay, it says that if it's davar shamin, then it's okay.
It's not okay.
That it's not okay. Then we do say blua Yotzeh. Okay. Next is when time transfers a blua Yotzeh, it doesn't necessarily transfer completely. Okay, then we have to start thinking about there's klipas and netilas, there's all kinds of those kinds of rules of how much, even if in cases it does transfer, it's not necessarily does it transfer completely. And the last thing is that Prima Government says is that when we say blue is not Yotzeh without routev doesn't mean moisture. Okay, it means routev, like a lot of liquid there. Okay, and literally the word routev means a sauce. Okay, it means like a lot. There's a lot there. He says just a little bit of moisture on the outside of a kli is not enough for us to say that that's considered blua Yotzeh. Okay, I'm sure that's again the cases. I'm saying he's talking about he needs the word routev, which will come that word is in the Gemara that this whole thing comes from. People's Chalto uses the word routev. He says it needs to be routev not just to have a little moisture. Okay, now
Routev is a lot.
like a meaningful amount of liquid, as opposed to just like a little bit of condensation on the outside of the
Roughly
liquid.
mean a lot.
What do you say?
Why does roughly mean a lot?
No, roughly means sauce.
Right.
But that's meant to give over the impression of this meaningful amounts rather than just little drops. Somehow. I'm not sure. Okay. Some examples, industrial, before we get to the real case. Okay. There's a few cases industrially where seemingly or potentially this din of Abel Yotzeh would be negeh. Okay. Where kalim are touching each other. Okay. Usually you don't think of kalim touching each other. What would a treif kalim be touching a kashrus kli? Okay. So I came up with some examples. Okay. One is there's such a thing as a double-plated heat exchanger. Okay, and that means is when a company is super afraid of, they're really worried that food is going to leak through a pinhole leak into the steam or into the hot water, what they'll do is they make a heat exchanger that has double plates instead of one plate being between the, let's say, the hot water and the milk. Instead of one plate being there, they have two plates being there. And this way, in case something leaks, let's say the milk would leak, it won't hit the water. It'll fall into a space in between them.
What's in that cavity?
Empty. It's empty. There's just two pieces of metal touching each other.
It's vacuum?
No, it's just nothing. Just two pieces of metal touching each other.
It's extremely inefficient.
Yeah, it's less efficient, but what they're gaining from that is, in case there's ever a leak, they don't have to worry about things transferring over to the other side. Okay, they're being extra careful about transfer. In case there'd be a hole in the metal, it won't get to the other side because you'd have to be two holes in the same place. That would not going to happen. So it'll just fall out the bottom. You know. Okay, there's such a thing. Okay, there's such a thing. There's another thing is that there are jacketed kettles. Usually in a jacketed kettle, the jacket is filled with steam. Okay, but there's such a thing of jacketed kettles where inside the kettle are coils. Okay, steam coils running through the jacket. So it's not, the steam is not in the jacket, the steam is in a coil that's in the jacket. In which case, the coil, the steam coil is touching your kettle, but there's no time transfers between them. Okay, so you don't have to worry about time going into the steam system, because this time goes through the metal into nothing. It hits the next cleat. It's a Blios going to clear the cleat. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, there's a similar thing, if you could call it. Another example is in some tanker trucks, we'll have, it looks like one plain trailer on the back, like every other truck, but really there's two compartments on the inside, okay, and they're touching each other. Okay, when you want to have, that way you can carry two small loads rather than one big load. Okay, the case, I know this has nothing to do with us, but the case, like a normal case is like for a gas station. Okay, and the gas station gets gasoline in a bunch of different levels of gasoline. So the same truck can bring them two different kinds, a half a load of this and a half a load of this, of the 87 and the 92, because they have, it's one truck comes, but it has two things on the inside. It has a nice big shiny cover on the top, but on the inside there's really two different tanks on the inside.
I'll tell you a practical example.
Yeah.
Tanker trucks are insulated.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hollow shell in the middle, and sometimes they are heated.
Mm-hmm.
But those are steam coils going through the open space.
Steam coils underneath the tank, correct. Correct. Oh, that's a good point. So the bleed doesn't go straight, wouldn't go from the food into the heating material.
Right.
Okay.
As opposed to rail cars, when they heat them, they have steam coils going literally through the open cavity.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Okay. That's a good point. Okay. That's good. Okay. And one last thing is that we once talked about that there are ways for things to be attached to each other that make them one cleat, like through welds and certain kinds of ways that make something it is one cleat. That the rules of Inable don't work anymore. Okay, now, another example where this came up, this is a different type of example.
So you would say that, I don't think you get to this, that the Chil you should be machmir.
So it's a good question. It's a good question. In all the cases that I told you, in almost every case that I told you, it's not even clear that the kalim actually touch each other. Okay, it's not clear they actually touch. Like the coils that are inside of a jacketed kettle, I'm not convinced that they actually touch the kettle.
I think, like you were saying, I think make it efficient.
But I'm not sure.
Heat,
I'm not sure if they do or they don't. And there's a question whether it works with hashgacha. And in the case I told you, if you remember, this is what I was supposed to tell you this. The Pri Megadim said that the reason why we kill hafchila about kalim touching each other is because it might spill. Okay, in none of these cases can something spill. Okay, in other words, they're sealed things. They're not things that can. They're solid things. We could talk about it. Okay, I'm going to talk.
If the whole, we don't see Blios even. If it's not in the jackets, there's 10%. So maybe
It's being filmed.
What? Well, that's okay. Yes, we can say that. That's fine.
What's on video?
We can tell people the truth. That's okay.
So maybe okay, fine. So even though we don't see it, we'll be machmir, but
Okay.
That's right. Maybe.
There we go. Okay, that's fine. Okay, now I have another case. where it's more sort of lamaisa, and that's like this. For Pesach, we tell people that they shouldn't use decaffeinated coffee unless they know how it was decaffeinated, and that's because, why? Because when you decaffeinate coffee, you mean you have to put some kind of a solvent through the coffee beans to get the caffeine out. Okay, so you decaffeinate, you remove the caffeine from them. So the concern is, one of the ways to do that is with a chemical called ethyl acetate. Ethyl acetate possibly is chametz. Okay, it could potentially be chametz. So if you decaffeinate with ethyl acetate, then the beans now you've taken out, you've used this chametz on top of it, and then you have problems potentially of it being chametz. Okay, we're not even talking about whether that's a real chashash or not. We're accepting that that's a chashash. Okay, well, the decaffeination is done to the green beans. Okay, green beans in coffee terms means beans before they're roasted. If you roast them, they're brown. Before them, they're called green beans. Okay, when they're fresh, they're fresher beans. They're called green beans. When they're green.
Not to be mixed up with green beans.
Right, that's correct. So you decaffeinate and then you roast it. So the question is, if decaffeinated coffee has a problem of this ethyl acetate, so then the roaster became chametz. So how can you even drink not decaffeinated coffee? The regular coffee, it was made in the same roaster. It's the same roaster. What's the difference? It's a roaster for all the coffee in the place. So today they made decaf, and an hour later they made regular coffee. So why are you concerned that you just made the machine chametz? Okay, so how can you even eat regular coffee?
It's cold or hot?
It's roasted.
That's for sure. No, that's why
we're not talking about whether it's a real chashash. I'm talking about assuming that that the beans are considered chametzik. That's like, don't drink decaf. Okay, that's a possibility. Maybe it didn't become chametzik in the first place. But no, you're saying, no, yes, it is chametzik. If it's chametzik, then my roaster is chametzik also. Okay, what's the difference?
Yeah, that's the answer.
Okay.
The ethyl acetate does not hit the bean itself.
If it's cold, what's it?
Absorbed in the bean. It's absorbed in the bean.
Okay.
Absorbed?
So there's lots to talk about whether that decaf is real. Sorry, we're not to talk about that. We're believing that it's chametzik and therefore it's a problem. So there's different answers for this question that I just answered you. One of the answers was Rabbi Cooper from Eretz Yisrael said, I think it was Eretz Yisrael then, Rabbi Cooper said this was in a blue Yotzeh, because we take coffee beans and we put them into a roaster. The chametz that's there is balua in the coffee beans. The blia from an oil can't go into a kli below routev. That's what it is. It's a big roaster. They stick all these dry beans into a big roaster. They're balua with chametz. The Habaluah Yotzeh make oil kli below routev. The balua can't come out from the coffee bean into the roaster. The roaster is not chametz.
The roasting process involves liquid because it pulls out.
No. Roast means without liquid.
No. It pulls out the moisture. That means it's coming in contact with something.
No.
How roasting works?
It's a bean. But
a bean.
No, it evaporates liquid out of it.
Imagine you put a pan in your oven and you put beans on a dry pan. You look inside, you're not going to see any routev or anything.
There's no routev. No. It's not. You're not roasting. You're not broiling a steak. There's going to be juice over there. You're broiling a bean. There's nothing in there. Okay, I thought it was a good answer. Okay, so next. Okay, next. That's a good reason to do something. Yes. There are other reasons, but that's a good reason. Yes. Okay.
You stick with Irish brands.
What are you talking about? That doesn't do anything. Okay, fine. Next. Okay, now.
Same place.
Another very common case where we said we would talk about this. Another common case is where we besomich on able Yotzeh is on your stovetop grates. Okay. Now, maybe for people today don't think of it like that, but because people today are very used to having milchigan fleshig stovetop grates. But for people who live in smaller,
What do you mean?
People are used to nowadays having separate grates.
I don't have that.
Okay, so lots of people don't. Lots of. I mean, like a milk oven and a flesh oven, but lots of people don't. Okay, here Baruch Hashem, two people who still live the way they're supposed to. So we have the separate milk. They have the same one, and what's the reason why? Is because the stovetop grate only touches a pot. Because it only touches the pot, so it touches say milk pot. Then tomorrow touches a flesh pot, but the bleed doesn't go. Right there. Okay. That's not. Well, I'm going to tell you full reason. Okay, but that's the main reason. The Mishpur says. And that's the question. So that's the question. So in Cain, why are we saying on that lechatchila? Would you let somebody put milk and flesh onto the same stovetop when if the Ramah says you shouldn't do it lechatchila? So why would we let that? Okay? So I'm going to tell you four things. The first is, Ksaf Sefer says, in his day they did the same thing, and they asked him that question. They said, then how come people make no? So he said we only don't let Blios go Kli when it goes from the milchiks to the flesha Kli. Don't let the milchik Kli touch the flesha Kli, or the treif touch the kosher. But over here, the milchik and flesha pots never touch each other. The milchik pot touches the grate, and then the flesha pot touches the grate. So there's an in-between. It goes from the milchik pot is touching the grate. The grate touching the flesha pot.
It's treif.
It's not treif. It's ample. It's l'chatchila. Don't let it touch. So here, they're not touching each other. The milchik and flesha pots are never touching each other.
It's worse, because milchik and flesha, it was treif, and flesha was treif. How's that answer the question?
What's treif?
Well, another question was that the grade's treif.
No. The grate is ample Yotzeh Kli. It only becomes treif because it touches the milchik
The
pot.
chumrah would be
So
consider this to be milchik. Well,
yes.
sure. Consider fleshing also.
Right. So he said.
So it's treif. So what is it?
So it's treif because.
Milchik and fleshing there. So this is the grade. So now milchik and fleshing pot, which equals treif.
Oh, so he's saying so l'chatchila we shouldn't no. No one said l'chatchila to consider it treif. That's b'diavad to consider treif. L'chatchila means don't do it. If you did it, it's perfectly fine. You shouldn't do it l'chatchila. So don't put the milk pot onto here. I put it onto okay, so fine, it's power. And I put the fleshing pot, it's power also. He said I shouldn't let the milk touch the fleshing, so the treif touch the kosher. What's it? 10 o'clock. I wasn't invited to the truck meeting. No idea. Okay. If I am, then no one told me. Anyhow, okay. So one is that's Ksaf Sefer says. Okay. He says there's nothing wrong with them touching an in between thing. Okay. Okay. Then he says the second answer. Ksaf Sefer says the second answer. He says is when you because the grate is always over the fire. Because the grate is over the fire, therefore the grate gets kashrus all the time. So when we say you shouldn't let kalim touch each other, you shouldn't have blue Yotzeh Kli, that's over here, the grate always sits over the fire. So even if we can't point to a specific second when we say now we technically met the rules of Habaluah or Libun Kal that we tried to do over here, he says, but it's always over the fire, yes, that's good enough, and that's considered kashrus. Okay? Ksaf Sefer. This is Ksaf Sefer's second answer. Okay? So Rav brings this. He says he likes it. He said maybe it could be that's what the Mishnah Berurah means. The Mishnah Berurah says when the Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Pesach, it says that for Pesach you should not use those grates. You have to kasher your grates from Chametz to Pesach. Okay, so Mishnah Berurah says it is year round. Don't worry about this. He says because enabel Yotzeh Kli. He's after it. One is enabel Yotzeh Kli. So don't worry about that. It's mutter minadin. And he says the second is the Mishnah Berurah says tar nisra v'holach loy kivin shabukol shah hi ala eish. So the Rav says, what the Ksaf Sefer would be reading that to mean, or he didn't read the Mishnah, but that we would be reading that to mean is that it gets kashered. When it sits on the fire, it gets kashered, and that's why during the year you could be meko, for year round, for Pesach we're machmir, and we say we have to kasher. Okay? So, just as an aside, before we move on, just talking about the Pesach side of it, is that that is to say, for Pesach we're being more makbid on Blua Yotzeh, which might be a reason why, for those who say that on Pesach you should not only cover your counters, but you should kasher them also. Okay, covering the counters is mutter. The reason why covering your counter is okay, covering the chametzik counter is because Blua Yotzeh, the blue won't go out from the chametzik counter into your pot because it'd have to go through the cover, and the cover, so Blios can't get through from one to the other. Roטב. So even if something spills on your counter, Blios can't get from the counter into the cover that you put on top of it because in a blue that's why covering something works. So that could be a reason why you want to kasher it first is because we want to be makbid to say for Pesach that we should be makbid. We're more makbid l'chatchila in a blue yotze. Okay, that's a side point. Okay, so that's what Rav said. Rav said, but lav dafka. He walked out. He missed. Rav said, lav dafka is that what the Mishnah Berurah means? You can understand the Mishnah Berurah to mean also that the fire burns up the blia. Okay? Which is to say it's not that the blia is absorbed into the grate and we think the fire is going to kasher it, but that the fire is going to keep the blia from getting in the first place, which is just like we had another din a few dinim ago, which was that if you have a little bit of food gets rolled from one pot to another pot, so we say if it's a small amount, the fire burns it up. It'll never be balua. Because small amounts get burnt up by the fire. So Ramesh says it could be that's what the Mishnah Berurah means, is that the fire being there means that if anything ever spilled over the pot, or any blios came out of the pot, it's a little bit would get burnt up by the fire. Okay, there are two versions of how to read what the Mishnah Berurah's second reason is. Okay, now, according to these, a difference, before we get to the last, okay, I'll say the last one, just to finish it up. Ramesh says another thing is, he says, Lamaisa, and the Stovetop talks like this also, he says, Lamaisa is that for many people, ooh, those are not even, look at that. For many people, the purple is higher than the blue. It's not even. Okay, for many people, it's not realistic. What do you tell them? They shouldn't cook. They have to have only, use only one grade for milk, one grade for fleshing. It's not lamaisa for them to have switched it up. So theoretically, we would want to be makbid, but it's only the chatchila, so shas is harat k'diavad. So the person's stuck. That's what he has to do. So he's okay. It's okay if he uses the same grades of both. So Kashrus says, there are people who are, more particular. They'll be careful to use separate ones. He says, but really, it's okay to be samach on this. So now, to be samach on it because the shas, what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to cook without being able to use the same grades for both? So the difference between the first and the fourth and the second and third, one nafkamin is what about the space that's between the pots? Okay, the pots are on between the grates. The grates are over the fire. So the second or the third reason apply to the grates themselves, because they're always on the fire. So either the fire kashrus the grates, or the fire protects the grates from Blios getting into them. But what about if you have this space in between, the space on your stovetop between the grates? So if you put down a milchik pot and a fleshik pot, Blios won't transit it because Yotzeh. So are you allowed to do it l'chatchila, or you're not allowed to do it l'chatchila? So let's say the first reason accepts over. He said is if it's indirect, if you use the same thing for both, put a milchik pot and a fleshik pot to the same place, that's okay. The whole issue was the whole l'chatchila is just for the milchik and fleshik touch each other. So then you could put in the space in between. Because it's still ain't a Yotzeh. It's dry. You're putting a hot pot onto this milk pot now, and then a fleshik pot later. They're both going into a place that's indirect. Then your milk is never touching fleshiks. Milk is coming here, and fleshik is coming here separate. You'd be allowed to. According to the second and third reasons, that it needs fire over there. There's no fire there. There's no fire kashing in, and there's no fire burning up the blios. Okay, and for sure the shas of doesn't apply either. In that case, because what's your shas of so you put it someplace else, or put something down. Okay, so there'll be a nafkamina between these reasons. If you need the fire part of it, then it only helps with there's a fire, not if there's no fire. Okay? Now, a modern variation of what I just said to you is an induction cooktop. Okay, we talked about it in the past, a long time ago. An induction cooktop is a cooktop that there's no heat on the cooktop. Okay, in a regular cooktop, in a regular stove, there's either a fire or an electric coil that makes it hot. And then you put your pot there, and that makes the food hot. Okay, and induction works through some kind of a magic, where there's a coil there. The coil, electricity flows through the coil, but it doesn't get hot. Okay, what happens is that only if you put a pot on it that's what's called ferromagnetic, and then a pot that would stick to a magnet. You put that kind of a pot there, that the electricity passes into the pot, and the pot becomes hot, and the food becomes hot. Now, the stovetop gets a little warm because there's a hot pot sitting on top of it. But be'etzim, there's no heat coming from underneath. There's electricity flowing from underneath that gets into the pot and magically makes the pot turn hot, and then it cooks the food, but there's no fire underneath it. Okay? So when we talked about in the past, we talked about whether it's a shayla b'shul yisrael. What happens if a guy puts food onto that fire? There's no fire. So is that considered bishul akum if a guy cooks on that food? Because there's Ramah talks about bishul akum maybe only applies when there's a fire, and there's no fire in this case. There's nothing that's like a fire-ish type of thing. It has similarities. So yeah, we talked about at the same time with that. Another thing we talked about is about Shabbos. Are you allowed to take your food off this thing? Because as soon as you take it off, electricity, when you take the pot off this induction cooktop, the electricity stops flowing. Electricity only flows when there's a fire there, when there's a pot there. And we also talked about how and if you could kasher this surface, because they tend to be glass. Okay, but today we're talking about is could you use the same one for milchik and fleshing. Okay, so if you see like the Ksef Sefer, if you see the Ksef Sefer, that it's okay to use the same surface for milchiks and fleshings. You just can't have one kli touch another kli rotev, where one is the milchiks and one is the fleishiks or the tray from the kosher, then over here you'd be allowed to. I put my milchik pot in it today, and I put my fleishik pot in it tomorrow, that's okay, because I'm never touching the milchiks till the fleishiks. Okay, but if you say you need a fire, the second and third reasons of the Mishnah, whichever one the Mishnah means that you need a fire, there's no fire here. There's no kashering or incinerating going on b'chlal over here. It's just a hot pot sitting there. Okay, and the shas of Takra mentioned yes.
It sounds very impractical, because as soon as you got spillages, you got problems.
Because
I'm having an indirect contact reason. Something spills.
You're saying that as soon as something spills, then it became really milchiks or really fleishiks. You're saying, so you're saying that I'm not. It's not gonna. It only helps, so to speak, once. But as sooner or later, you're going to spill something out of your pot. At which point, it's going to be really milchiks or fleishiks. So that's an interesting point. I didn't think of that. Okay, that's an interesting point. Ramosha's shas of tak will still be true. When he says, like, what Moshe says, well, I'm stuck, Again, even if something spills...
Again, when something spills, it might...
No, it's not true, because when something spills, now it's milchiks. Okay, so what? So it's
a... They got a problem with the oven.
No. So I have a milchik stovetop. So now, what's wrong with putting fleishik pot onto a milchik stovetop? It's in a blue Yotzeh. No bleed is going to come out of that stovetop into my fleishik pot, except for the chatchila.
Except for something spills now for the fleishiks.
So if something would spill, I'd be up the creek. But if Ramesh says, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to cook there? So that would potentially apply. Now there's an extra bonus here, extra advantage over here is that the surface is glass. Okay, the surface is this flat surface. Underneath it are these magical coils that do their induction trip. So we have extra cool over here, which is that it's glass over here from which we assume there's no Blios. We're only Ashkenaz only machman Chatchila to say that they're bleeding into glass. Maker we assume there's no bleeding into glass. So if there's no bleeding into glass, so it can't become treif. Who cares? It can't become milk and fleishiks.
You're saying you pass on Allah so that we pass on
But the Eved, there's no bleeds into glass. So when the whole thing is about Chatchila in the first place, to have bleeds touching each other,
so
the Yotzeh,
the glass, you say the it's okay?
Right. So we even the document says even in case of shas attack, you can be someone there's no bleeds. So we're talking about a thing that's only us in the first place to put the pot down there. The things are there's no right there. So I put things down. So it's only a shayla. Can I lechatchila do it? So you say it's only a shayla lechatchila anyhow, and we hope that's mutter. So that would be a possible reason to do that. There are people who avoid these kind of problems. They sort of defeat the purpose. They put down discs on there for the cooking. They sort of defeat the purpose of the induction cooktop. They un-induction their cooktop.
It doesn't work.
What do you mean?
It won't work.
No, they put their metal. You can buy metal discs that are basically they make these discs for people who don't have pots that fit onto an induction stovetop. You have a pot that is not ferromagnetic. So you put this disc down. It's ferromagnetic. It becomes hot and it heats up your pot. So you have a milk one and a fleishik one. You put the milk down one.
So what's the problem?
Well, there's no problem except that you're defeating the purpose. You got the induction cooktop because you wanted to have this special feature. You just put the pot down and take it off. It's not hot anymore. The fire turns itself off essentially. Here you left the disc here. The disc is doing the whole thing. But anyhow, let's say you move into an apartment. So you were stuck with it. You didn't buy it. You had this thing there. So you were stuck with it. So then there are people who do. Okay.
But it's not every